coupled, that sort of crony capitalism, coupled with a healthy dose of corruption, means that at the beginning of last year, we had a backlog of over 5,000 prospecting rights, mining rights, renewals and new applications. And yeah, I mean, that's where we left now with this effectively dysfunctional act.
South Africa is blessed with a rich endowment of mineral resources, and for over a century, the mining industry has formed the foundation of the country's economic development. However, the future of the mining industry is highly uncertain. Joining me to discuss is Paul Miller. He is a mining finance professional. Paul Miller, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David.
So, Paul, before we start the conversation, could you give our viewers and listeners just some background as to how you got involved in the mining industry?
My first job was as a management consultant. And one of my engagements was underground productivity improvement in the deep level gold mines. And I picked up some of the unique language that mining has. And then when I found myself as working for one of the local banks as an investment banker, corporate financier, my teammates quickly realized that maybe I knew a little bit about more than they did about mining. And I was invited to become a mining specialist corporate financier. And it was at a very special time in South Africa's mining history. It was the 5 years ahead of the global financial crisis, where we were busy processing the effects of the new mineral rights regime that came into effect with the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act. That act was promulgated in 2000. Well, it was passed in 2002 and came into effect in 2004. And it's that act and its related mining charters that effectively form the base of our regulatory environment. At that time, it drove a lot of change in activity and sales and listings on the stock exchange, etc. And it was a good time to be in that field. And then after that, I actually got hired by a client to go and run a coal mining company, which we listed on the JSE. We built one coal mine. We bought and turned around a distressed anthracite mine. And then I returned to banking as a debt financier, principally, after that. So I've done it basically a bit of everything as in mining finance and mining operations, mining project development. And I think as a consequence, I have something of an abusive relationship with the smaller end of the mining industry, because I've seen the incredible impact it can have on people's lives and the fact that it can be done in a way that impacts on the environment, for example, can be mitigated. So our operations down in KwaZulu-Natal were the best paying jobs in the district were on the mine. And unfortunately, that's all been lost. What we did prior to the global financial crisis can't happen again.
So, Paul, in South Africa, the state is the custodian of all mineral rights. You need to apply to the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy for a permit and a license to mine. So effectively, you own the property rights on the topsoil, but none of the mineral rights beneath the surface. Do you think that has led to a kind of ossification of mining, of new prospecting in the country? And what is global best practice in terms of that?
So the great promise of the new mineral rights regime, the silver lining, so to speak, was that we would introduce the concept of use it or lose it. And that is best practice around the world. This idea that repeated teams of explorers get the opportunity to pick over properties, to discover what is there, and generally a tier one deposit is discovered by the fourth or fifth, or is realized by the fourth or fifth team to look at it. And that by allowing people to explore, to, on relinquishment of their prospecting rights, submit their data to the state, then the state, as the custodian of the mineral rights, will have an ever-increasing endowment of knowledge on its mineral rights. Now, under the previous regime, mineral rights were private. They were private property, initially linked to the surface rights. So the surface rights holder owned whatever was below the soil. And then what then happened over a century ago was the major mining houses were able to then sever the mineral rights below the ground from the surface. So farmers would sell the mineral rights below their property, and it would be registered against the title deed and held as private property by those major mining finance houses. And the mining finance houses were actively hostile to all and any new entrants or junior miners. So we had under apartheid, when only white people could run those sorts of businesses, even then, the system was actively hostile to junior miners and new entrants, white junior miners and new entrants. And the Chamber of Mines actively campaigned against skills leaving their employ, people setting up consultancies, people starting new businesses to compete with the mining finance houses. So if there was ossification, it was more under the old system than the new. So then we get this new system, and it's going to be, the grand promise is use it or lose it. And we're going to go to what would we call it, a best practice situation where people can look over the properties, knowledge will be generated, and the people of South Africa would benefit from all these new mines. And the flip side of that was that there were some other conditions that were attached to these rights as well, in particular the BEE requirements, right? So that was the grand promise, and it led to a flourishing of activity prior to the global financial crisis. Unfortunately, since then, it's really all come crumbling down.
All right. And so obviously this process that you just described, I mean, that assumes that you have some kind of capable bureaucracy, a functional state that can administer this judiciously and fairly. But as we've seen,
absolutely.
There's been,
I mean, David, that's
huge...
absolutely it, right? It requires an extraordinary amount of non-discretionary competence. You need guardrails, you need rules and regulations that limit the discretion of officials, and you need transparency, and you need to apply the rules fairly and equally. And I mean, one of the principles is first come, first serve. If you are the first applicant for a prospecting right and you meet the requirements of the prospecting right, you can get it. If you complete the prospecting works program and there's something economic, you then have the first right to apply for a mining right, meet the requirements of the mining right. You can then mine for 20 years, renew for 20 years. So certainty of tenure was meant to be there, but, and there's always a but, right? The competence and the corruption, or the incompetence and corruption within the DMRE has been so severe that we now have a backlog of prospecting right renewals, mining right renewals, new prospecting rights, new mining rights, that at last count, and they do not disclose the detail, but at the last time we had any kind of insight into how big that backlog was, it would take in excess of a decade to clear if we had no further applications.
And why do we see such deep systemic problems in the DMRE? What is going wrong there?
Well, first of all, look, corruption. I mean, there's no question there've been enough court cases, corruption, but also politicking and lobbying. They admit themselves that they've issued prospecting rights, and you can just see the names of people who've been awarded prospecting rights and mining rights: the connected, the cronies, the well-established sort of ANC royalty families. You see all of that. That's writ large across the whole mining industry. In fact, the established mining industry has promoted and abetted that, in that they, is your BE partner connected? Well, that should be a red flag, not something you should be proud of. Anyway, so what we saw was, in the way that the Act was drafted, it has, I think, 14 principles in Section 2. And the principles of objectives. The Act has these objectives, and the objectives are very wide-ranging. They need to encourage new entrants. They need to transform. They need to promote security of tenure. They need to promote economic development of South Africa. So there are these high-level objectives of the Act, which include economic growth, transformation. Some of them actually contradictory to each other. Okay, so they're the wish list of what the legislature wants the Act to achieve. And they're all very noble, right? And they are sometimes contradictory. And then you have the actual requisites within the Act of what is required to meet the conditions of being awarded a mining right or a prospecting right. And what has happened is that the officials and the politicians have made their own interpretation of how the objectives of the Act can be met. And they've applied the objective as overriding the underlying requirements in the Act. So, for example, in section 17(1)(a), you can go and read it if you like, which is the requirements to be issued a prospecting right. Any party applying for prospecting right is required to demonstrate, in fact, required to have funding and the technical ability and skills to optimally apply an approved prospecting works program. So you've got to go and get a scientifically correct prospecting works program. You need to get a professional geologist, draw it up, and then you need to then demonstrate that you've employed people or you yourself have the skills that can apply that scientific program, because that's what geology is, and that you've got the funds, you've got access to funds to actually implement that plan. Now, that's an absolute requirement. It's not something that around which there's any discretion. So now we have these absolute requirements in the body of the Act, that the law is now settled. There was the Aquila Resources court case that went over 6 years through every level of the courts, all the way up to the Constitutional Court. And it's effectively settled law. I'm saying this as a non-lawyer, settled law that the requisites, the requirements to be issued a prospecting right, or in that case, a mining right, cannot be overridden by the broad high-level objectives of the Act. Okay, so if the objective of the Act is to open up, one of the 14 is to open up the industry to new players, that doesn't mean you can give people prospecting rights who do not have the money or the ability to explore. Okay, now that is settled law, but that is what the department has done over and over and over again. So they themselves admit, previous deputy minister said it in a speech, said, we've been granting prospecting rights to people who have neither the funds nor the technical ability to implement those prospecting rights. And I want to put my hand up and say, but that was unlawful. It's unlawful for the minister to grant prospecting rights or mining rights to people who don't meet the basic requirements, regardless of to what extent they can argue that the objectives of the Act are being met. So we've got this complex set of laws where effectively the officials became activists, and they took their own interpretation of how they'd like to achieve the objectives of the Act, and they rode roughshod over the rest of the Act, coupled that sort of crony capitalism, coupled with a healthy dose of corruption, means that at the beginning of last year, we had a backlog of over 5,000 prospecting rights, mining rights, renewals and new applications. And yeah, I mean, that's where we left now with this effectively dysfunctional Act.
All right, so Paul, what has been the effect of this on the mining industry in South Africa?
It's complex, right? Because what I've been talking about is largely about the future, the effect on the future of the industry. So the existing incumbents, the members of the Minerals Council of South Africa that negotiated the MPRDA back in prior to 2002, it's pretty clear what their strategy has been. They had sunk capital in South Africa, literally holes in the ground, that they needed to protect whatever return they could from those assets. So they were prepared to negotiate away anything that they hadn't spent money on, obviously, right? So they needed to protect their sunk capital, and they did that by negotiating this grand compromise, which was the MPRDA and the Mining Charter. And the grand compromise had them doing these elaborately structured 26% BEE deals, but they could effectively phase that over, initially it was to 2009 for 15%, and then to 2014 for 26%. And then the courts have eventually found that if you did that you got empowered. You don't have to now do another empowerment deal. So all our existing mining companies, the incumbents are sitting on the existing assets with legal decisions saying that they can continue to hold them. Okay, so you've got to put that aside. They've found, they've negotiated this transition process. They've gone through their BE deals. The courts have found it. And quite frankly, nobody in South Africa has ever had a mining right cancelled or confiscated.
Those BE provisions are now, that's up to 30% under the latest iteration of the
No, it's
charter.
actually not, right? Because those provisions have been overturned in the mining charter.
Okay.
So there is no requirement. So the law is now settled. If you did a BE deal, you don't have to redo it, okay? Unless, of course, they change the law, right? And if you're applying for a new mining right, you might have to do 26 or 30%, right? But what my point's different. If you have in your hand a prospecting right, a mining right, and you went through that process, in other words, you held it back in 2002, if you were a Glencore or a Anglo-American or any one of the large companies, Kumba Iron Ore in the Northern Cape, if you held the mining right, you went through that transition process, you did your BE deal, it might have unwound, it might not, you find today on your existing mine, okay? But you're sure as anything not going to go and take a chance exploring for new resources in South Africa. And now that's where the conundrum comes in, because that was 20 years ago, right? Now mines don't last forever. And South Africa is extraordinarily blessed with incredible long life mines. And this idea exists somehow that these mines are going to last forever, but they're not. Many of our mines have about 12 years left, right? And in fact, when I've been addressing audiences of geologists, gray-haired geologists, and I say, how many mines are still going to be operating in 20 years? And they start counting them, and everyone can think of some, right? Venetia will be operating, and, South Deep will be operating, and you can go through which mines, but people run out of mines before they run out of fingers, okay? So the nature of mining is that you've got to constantly fill the pipeline of projects by exploring for mines. But our incumbent miners have given up on South Africa. They've done everything they can to protect the returns on their sunk capital, and they do nothing outside of those mines. The regulatory, it's too difficult for them. So what do? We decide, we recognize that people have been complaining and pointing this out for I've been doing it for over a decade, saying we need to fill our pipeline of new projects, and we can only do that by exploring. So now finally the state has come out with an exploration strategy. They recognize it as a problem, but they negotiated that exploration strategy with the very people who haven't been exploring for the last 20 years. Big mining companies are not good at exploration. It's two different businesses.
Okay, so there's a lack of greenfield investment, high barriers to entry for some of the smaller miners. And look, if you watch the budget speech by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, you would have seen those budget deficits reducing somewhat. We still have, I think it was about 5.7% deficit, which is still pretty high, but not as high as it was during COVID with about 10% deficit.
So our existing mining industry has come to the table, and they have, with these wonderful international commodity prices, they've pulled us out of a hole, but they have no future. Every one of those mines is finite, and there's nothing filling the pipeline. And, you can, nobody seems to think, I suppose finally they've realized that this is a problem. So then they came out with this strategy. But you just take that back a bit. There are very few mines that are going to be operating beyond about 12 years from today. And I keep on mentioning, I'm saying, look, if you are 18 and you're leaving school and you're considering a career path, I haven't met a senior mining executive who would recommend that 18-year-old go into South African mining industry. And yet the geology classes, the mining engineering classes are full, but they're not going to be employed past the age of about 35 or 40 because the pipeline's empty. The pantry is empty, and once we've eaten our existing mines, they're gone and there's nothing to replace them. Strangely, we've never had more prospecting rights issued but they've all been unlawfully issued to people who can't implement the prospecting the prospecting works program. Effectively, we've gone back to the situation where prospecting rights are kept, or mineral rights collectively are kept unworked and dormant, because we've been repeatedly issuing these prospecting rights to people who can't do anything with them because they're politically connected or they can lobby or politic. They're not supposed to get a prospecting right unless they've got the money and the ability to actually use it. And we should be canceling those prospecting rights every year. Inspection, have you spent your money? Show me an audit certificate. What are your results? Where's your report on your prospecting findings? If you haven't spent the money and you haven't submitted a report, we cancel your prospecting right. That hasn't happened. So we haven't had the turnover and the knowledge development. I mean, in the MPRDA, it is a requirement that every year a prospecting rights owner submits a report on their progress to the regional manager of the DMRE, and that report and that information on relinquishment, all that information is meant to go to the Council for Geoscience to be curated as part of the South Africa's national endowment of geological knowledge. And that hasn't happened. The Council for Geoscience hasn't been getting those reports. So we've had, 2 decades of exploration without increasing the net knowledge of our prospecting, of our geological endowment. And, the industry, the existing incumbent miners don't care because they're only interested in the existing mines. And they certainly don't get activist, the only success they appear to have is when they eventually stiffen their spines and litigate against the department. Every negotiation they go into, they come out the loser.
And as a consequence, South Africa's ranking in the Fraser Institute Mining Index, which is released every year, we're slipping ever further down those rankings. I think we're now 75th out of 84 countries, down there at the bottom with countries like Venezuela. I think Zimbabwe is last. So that means that we are being outcompeted globally. And yeah, we might be getting some rents from some of these minerals exports in the short term, but I think we're sleepwalking our way into a longer term crisis.
No, absolutely are. And the funny thing is the policymakers don't even realize they're in a competition. The policymakers think that you negotiate with your existing, big business, big government and big labor can get together and reach a social compact, and we'll come up with a strategy for exploration, and our existing mining industry will explore. Our existing mining industry is not in the business of exploration. To the extent, there's a small gold mine in the Northwest called Kalgold. It's an open pit gold mine. It's in the Kraipan Greenstone Belt, and it's owned by Harmony Gold. Now, that Kraipan Greenstone Belt, it's an area that's got geological potential for gold, and Harmony actually had prospecting rights over it. But Harmony couldn't do the exploration because they didn't have any exploration geologists in South Africa. They had to go and get their exploration geologists from Australia, who Harmony employs in Australia for their Papua New Guinea projects, and bring them to South Africa to plan an exploration program because they don't have explorationists. So the idea that our existing government our government can negotiate with our existing mining industry to come up with a solution to exploration, it's like going to the local Toyota dealership and asking them to manufacture cars. They might both be in the business of cars, but they're in different industries. At least now, the state has come up with this strategy document. And I've been trying to engage with this exploration strategy for the mining industry that was published. It's been gazetted. It's not clear what exactly its legal status is because it was never made open for public comment. So it's a document that was negotiated between the government and the Minerals Council, represented by some explorers and junior miners at the Minerals Council. It was no public consultation, no comments there was no consultation with academics, with the Geological Society, the Geophysics Society, any of the learned societies, foreign investors, other countries for advice. There was none of that. The Minerals Council and the DMRE and the Council for Geoscience thought they could do it on their own. And quite frankly, it's such a poor document that if I was a lecturer, I'd have to call in the student and try and establish if they understood the assignment properly. It's laughably poor, cringeworthy. In fact, it's embarrassing to be a South African and in the mining industry with that as a cabinet-approved, gazetted strategy document.
Yeah, and I think in South Africa's politics in 2022, we're big fans of this social compacting idea that we have all of the stakeholders around the table. But what it produces actually is a lot of mediocrity and kind of race to the bottom, lowest common denominator. But I think also we have to interrogate the mining charter itself. And it has all these lofty ambitions for community upliftment and transformation. But when I read transformation, I see empowerment of politically connected elites rather than kind of poor Black people who might live in a rural area, for example. So, and I think that we need to be a bit more skeptical when we look at these kinds of policy documents, which kind of speak the language of transformation, but it actually is a way, Trojan horse for driving through corruption and political patronage.
Where it's most acutely felt is with money that hasn't been sunk into the ground yet. And you can't negotiate with money that's sitting in London or Toronto. You've got to solicit investment. You've got to compete for that investment. You've got to tell that money why money doesn't have emotion. It doesn't have loyalty. It goes where capital goes, where it's treated best. Now, what we've had in South Africa is we've had the representatives of sunk capital, which can't go somewhere else, negotiating with government and losing at every turn. Okay. And where, so that's who's been negotiating. They've been losing because they can't take their money out. It's sunk into the ground. But what has lost is future money. And we're seeing that it's textbook. We're seeing that no money's been put into exploration. And as a consequence, our mining industry is in short, medium-term decline. It will be gone. Sunset industry is not a strong enough term. It's worse than that. We're beyond the dusk now. And of course, all those things that you were describing, mining companies being required to provide various municipal services or everything from enterprise development to ownership transformation, all of those are simply costs. They can all be costed. And what it does is it drives a lot of projects out of the range of being economic. So what we're effectively doing is we're saying we're going to layer all these costs and we're going to make them difficult to understand and give officials discretion to apply them. So they're quite hard to determine exactly what they're going to be. And then we might change them as we go along every 5 years as well. So we'll increase them. And then we're going to apply that against the known geology. And then we're going to wonder why there's only 1 or 2 projects coming online. It's because your costs have risen higher than what allows the others to be economic. And all of this that's why I'm saying that the strategy document is so poor, because it's like this person who got the job to write it doesn't understand the assignment. And where it gets even more weird, and I can only use the word weird, is that the target is to attract between 12 and 13 billion rand a year, every year of spending on exploration, because that's what they say 5% of global exploration in 2025. It's a 5-year target, but they actually started the process 2 years back. So we're already almost halfway. That 12 billion is a 10-fold increase over what Stats SA says is currently being spent on exploration. So it's not like a 10% increase. It's a 10-fold, a 10 times increase.
You have to be ambitious.
No, so that's a radical improvement, right? But the plan suggests nothing like that. The plan suggests, and I had another look at it, right? I hurt my eyeballs. But the plan suggests that a 200 million rand exploration fund will be established by industry and the IDC, that the Council for Geoscience will get increased spending. Their current budget, they spend about 200 million a year on exploration. So between, what do we got there? If they double the Council for Geoscience's budget and we get it. Like the financial aspects of the plan is about 400 million rand. The target is 12 billion. No, then they're going to go and market. They're going to market South Africa's geology to the world. It's like, as I said, if your target is 12 billion a year every year from 2025, surely you should have a financing section in the plan. You know what the section on financing says? It says, no, the Minerals Council must go and talk to the JSE. Do they know that the JSE itself doesn't have any money? Like, not go and talk to National Treasury about tax incentives for junior mining and exploration. Go and talk to the JSE. It's like, it was a failure as a first-year strategy paper. I'm going to talk at the Junior Mining Conference coming up in June, and I'm arguing for a motion, or, it's one of these fun sessions that we have, to say that our mining professionals must all expect to be unemployed or have to emigrate or have a career change in about 15 years.
So aside from emigrating or changing careers, how do we go about rescuing this very important industry? Because this is the Solutions Podcast. So I'd be keen to hear from you what your plan would be if you were the Minister of Minerals.
Well, I think what you have to do is first of all, you have to understand the problem you're trying to solve. And the problem you're trying to solve is that you've got very limited time to get a lot of exploration done to refill the pipeline. So first of all, you've got to get urgent, right? Time is against you. It took them 3 years to come up with this document, which is rubbish anyway. Then you've got to understand the size of the problem. It's 12 billion. The only way we could possibly mobilize that money is by attracting foreign investment, A, and B, attracting capital from our own public markets, the stock exchange, right? And the only way we can do that is by providing incentives for people to invest in exploration. In other words, the flow-through shares, for example, that they have in Canada. So we've got to actually give up on some of the objectives of the MPRDA if we to have any mining industry at all, right? So we've got to go to foreign investors and say, we're not going to expect you to do all these extra things, okay? And we are going to write it into our law that we won't change the rules for at least 20 years. And then we're going to have to get incentives for individuals to invest in exploration via our stock exchange, and really understand that the flip side of a lively exploration industry is a well-developed public market. The countries that do this well use their public markets to fund it, Australia and Canada in particular. This strategy that the government came up with practically doesn't mention the public markets or how the public market money can be mobilized on public markets. And then, of course, underlying all of that is that the administration has collapsed, right? So you'd want to put in place an off-the-shelf cadastre. And the first thing you have to do is to understand that South Africa's never bought a cadastre before. So there is no level 4 BEE cadastre provider, okay? Because we've never had one before. So you'd have to remove that requirement and go to the international providers of such systems and allow them to come in and implement it. And they could do it in a year. And then we would have a transparent, online, accessible cadastre. And then finally, you must cancel all the prospecting rights where people aren't doing anything, regardless of how well politically connected they are.
Right, Paul. And you mentioned South Africa's capital markets, and you've been writing publicly. There's a piece in the Daily Maverick, how to rescue South Africa's broken capital markets. And we'll link to that in the show notes. And I think South Africa, unlike many other African countries, got fairly liquid capital markets, able to raise financing locally. But we are seeing a delisting wave, many companies going off of the JSE and going private. What's driving that, and how does that connect with our earlier discussion around the state of mining investment more broadly?
Exactly as we've been sleepwalking into the sunset of our mining industry, we have been sleepwalking into the sunset of our public capital markets too. And it's taken me a long time to kind of work it out. But what it is that in short, provided enormous numbers of tax incentives to individual savers, but we've allowed institutions to be the gatekeeper and to collectively monopolize access to those tax incentives, which means that all our funding largely is now through institutions, and they all have a size and liquidity constraint. So they will only invest in the, depends who you ask, either the top 80, the top 100, or the top 140 companies. But basically the 11 institutions that manage 90%, if you include the PIC, 90% of all our funds under management in South Africa invest only in the top 100, 140 companies on the stock exchange. And what increasingly has happened in the last decade is all our retail investors with the stockbrokers have been moved into those same institutional funds or into model portfolios that mimic those institutional funds. And it's no fault of the small companies. Simply because they are small, they cannot attract investor interest. And exploration companies always start small. So there is no space in our public markets for exploration, unlike Canada and Australia. And then question is asked, well, what do they do? Well, they provide tax incentives for retail investors to invest directly in smaller companies. And we have no discussion of that here. National Treasury is completely blind to the problem. And it's taken I've had to write a lot of stuff before even the people at the JSE, etc., are starting to recognize that it doesn't matter what their rules are or how expensive or cheap it is to list on the JSE. It's not, the JSE is just the market square. You can make it as pretty as you like. But if all the investors are wholesalers, they're not going to buy small quantities of product. And that's effectively my point about our public market. So if you want a lively, dynamic, effective exploration scene in your country, and we've got the geology to support that, you do need good administration. It's a basic requirement. We don't have that. Good regulation and administration. You need good pre-competitive data, and the Council for Geoscience understands that and is starting to produce more pre-competitive. This is the base science that's required. But the access to finance means that you actually have to be able to, the flip side of developing the exploration market is also doing public market development, right? You need to say, well, actually it's a good thing to have retail investors. It's a good thing for people to take a punt on a stock. It's not bad that people, get involved. Think about this. The JSE has 450,000 individual investors. One cryptocurrency online exchange has 5 times as many in South Africa alone. I think we've got, people are happy to invest online and trade. They're just not happy to invest online and trade on the JSE. And that's something we need to address.
And how would you suggest addressing it?
You've got to firstly acknowledge that a diversity of smaller investors is good for the public market. Okay, if you think it's bad for the public market, as I think the FSCA thinks it is, they don't want, it's very nanny state-ish. They don't want individuals to take any risk with their retirement savings, for example. But the problem with that is that if you force all individuals to invest through institutions, the institutions only go for the large and the liquid. So you've got to acknowledge that it's good for public markets to have a diversity of smaller investors, and then you've got to provide incentives, as the Australians, as the British, as the Canadians do, for people to put their own money into the stock exchange. And that's tax incentives. So you've got to provide incentives for people to invest in the smaller end of the stock exchange. And they do it in the UK, they do it in Canada, they do it in Australia. In South Africa, our regulators want everyone to give their money to an institution. Problem is the institution doesn't invest in the smaller end of the stock exchange.
So Paul, I think what's characterized our conversation is this theme that often policies are intended to do one thing, but actually have all sorts of unintended effects. And you've mentioned incentives quite a lot in the discussion. And, when I see incentives, I often see an implicit subsidy for a particular kind of outcome. And trying to maybe design things in a particular way, and perhaps there's a risk that you have more unintended consequences. So what are some of the second order effects of incentives? I mean, I know you mentioned other markets, but
I mean, you're right.
What about
right?
here?
Okay. You're absolutely right. And we've seen National Treasury withdraw from having targeted tax incentives for different industries because people are clever, and the expensive lawyers are hired by the private sector, and they find a way, right? We saw that with the 12J industry. So you're absolutely correct. But there is one difference, is that we are not the test bed. The incentives I'm talking about work successfully in other markets. Other countries have tested them for decades. So I'm not suggesting we try and invent something new. And you always have to be wary of incentives having those second order effects. And it's true. And we see now, National Treasury's now said, withdrawn all tax incentives. We're going to try and drop the overall corporate tax rate, right? That's fine. But for 30 years, their process of reform of our financial sector has resulted in more than half of all companies delisting. Now, that's an unintended effect too, right? When the Jacobs Committee report was published in 1992, which is the report that forms the basis for all our capital markets reform that have come subsequently, they said that this flow of funds, the flow of contractual savings into institutions and therefore into the equity markets, would lead to a flourishing of rights issues and new companies listing. What's actually happened, unintended, the exact opposite. We've more than halved the number of listed companies on our stock exchange. So I'm fully alive to this idea that incentives can have the wrong effect. And in fact, I would put it to you that the incentives that we've given for investors to save, where we've made the institutions the gatekeepers, has resulted in a second order effect of far fewer listed companies, even though the total amount of savings has increased. That's not what they expected. It's not what the members of the Jacobs Committee, they predicted the opposite. So now here we are sitting 30 years later with an unintended effect of an incentive. But as I said, the advantage we have is we can look at how flow-through shares or exploration company tax credits work in Canada and Australia. We can look at how the AIM market has over 1,000 companies listed on it in the UK, whereas our Altex only has 21.
So Paul, just to close this conversation off, what recommendations would you give to policymakers and also industry professionals, particularly in the mining industry, to resuscitate and revive this really critical foundation of South Africa's economy?
I don't think professionals in the mining industry can do anything except try and make sure that their skills are transferable into another industry, or that they internationalize their careers. We're almost too far gone, right? It takes the international standard for the development of a tier one mining asset. In other words, from discovery to production of a globally significant mine is between 15 and 20 years. We haven't made those discoveries. So in 15 or 20 years, we're going to have no new tier one mines. So if you are 18 and going into a geology career, try and internationalize yourself, or try and pick up like the data science skills, etc., that go with that, because there's a very good chance that you're going to be doing something different before you halfway through your career. I think the only possible solution here, we have to go to zero. We have to hit reset. In other words, we need a change in government. We need a change in ideology, and we need maybe the World Bank or someone to come in with a template, benchmark, globally proven mining rights regime and force it onto the country. And I really don't see that. I'm always hopeful. I have this abusive relationship with the mining industry. I know that, I love the mining industry, but what can you say when this piece of garbage that is this exploration strategy is jointly developed by the scientists in the Council for Geoscience, the DMRE, and the Minerals Council? I mean, the Minerals Council should be hiding their heads in shame that they even participated in the exercise. I mean, they should be disowning the entire thing. But of course, they're always trying to do the backroom negotiation, get the best possible outcome for their existing sunk capital, while their parent companies invest in other countries.
Well, Paul, this has been a fascinating discussion about the mining industry in South Africa. I think it is stuck in a very deep hole at the moment. So hopefully we can help it to climb out with conversations like these. But I wanted to thank you very much for joining me on the Solutions Podcast.
Thank you, David.
If you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, why don't you leave a review there as well and send it to your friends or family who may find it interesting. My name is David Ansara. This is the Solutions Podcast. Until next time, take care.